Your hands are shaking, not from cold. From the weight of what you just pressed your thumb into. The wax is still warm under your fingerprint. The witnesses are already turning away. You are still standing in the same street, wearing the same tunic, breathing the same Roman air. But something has changed. You don't have a word for it yet. You just signed your body away. And Rome is going to hold you to every letter of it. History calls it Nexum, a debt contract, a legal arrangement between a citizen who needed grain and a man who had it. That is what the records say. But that's not what this was. Nexum was a machine, built by the men who owned Rome's land, Rome's courts, and Rome's law for the purpose of converting your economic desperation into their permanent labor supply. It worked precisely. You needed grain after a failed harvest. You had no alternative, so you went to a Patrician. He offered you a contract. You would receive the loan. In exchange, you pledged your body as collateral, not your property, your body. If you repaid in full, you walked away free. If you defaulted, and the interest rate was designed to make default nearly certain, your body belonged to him, legally. Not as a metaphor. As Roman law, the ceremony required witnesses. It required formal words spoken aloud. It required bronze weighed on a scale. Rome made this feel like law. And here is the part they never teach. The men who designed that ceremony were the same men waiting on the other side of it. You were not poor, not by the measure of Rome's lowest. You were a plebeian farmer, a free citizen. You had a small plot of land outside the city walls, enough to grow wheat and emmer grain, enough to feed your family through winter. In good years, enough surplus to sell at market. You paid your taxes. You served in Rome's legions when the Republic called. You came home. You went back to the furrows. That was the life. It was not rich, but it was yours. You had a son who was learning to work the rows beside you, a wife who managed the grain store through the cold months. You were not a man with nothing. You were a man with something worth protecting. And in Rome, freedom was not an abstraction. It was a legal status with teeth. It meant you could vote in the assemblies. It meant you could speak in your own defense before a magistrate. It meant no man could touch your body without your consent. Then came one season, not two, not three, one drought. The harvest came back at a third of what it should have been. Enough grain to survive the winter, not enough to plant in spring. You needed seed grain. You went to every option you had. Neighbors, relatives, the market, nothing. And here is the part the system had already calculated. There was one man in your district who always had grain to lend, every year, no matter the drought, no matter the season. His stores never ran empty. You told yourself you would repay it before summer. You believed that. The system needed you to believe that. The contract required 5 adult male witnesses, a bronze balance scale, formal words spoken in sequence. The creditor weighed out the bronze in front of everyone. You spoke the words you were told to speak, and that was it. You were a nexus debtor. Here is what that meant under Roman law. You still walked home that night. You still slept under your own roof. You still worked your own land, for now. But your body was no longer fully yours. If you defaulted, the creditor had the legal right to seize your person, not your property. You. He could bring you to his estate and work you in his fields. He could chain you if he judged it necessary. Roman law allowed him to hold you for 60 days before any formal magistrate process was required. 60 days. With your body. Before anyone was required to ask a single question. The interest rate on your loan was called unciarium finis, 1/12 of the principal per year. That sounds survivable. It was not. It compounded. Your harvest was variable. The creditor controlled when the debt was formally assessed. Within 3 years of a modest loan, at these rates poorly managed, your debt had grown beyond what 2 full harvests could clear. Not because you were careless, because the calculation was built that way before you signed. But the system had another layer. Your debt did not end with you. If you died still in bondage, the obligation transferred directly to your son. The boy learning the furrows beside you, the one you were working to protect, he inherited the full balance. The interest kept moving. Let us be exact about the mathematics. You borrowed enough grain to plant 2 jugera of land, a modest debt. At Roman interest rates, compounding annually, with your creditor controlling the assessment dates. Inside 3 years, you owed more than 2 consecutive full harvests could repay. The creditor knew this before the ceremony. He knew it before he offered you the grain. He had run the same calculation on your neighbor's father. Once you defaulted, your legal status changed. You were no longer a debtor working toward repayment. You were a nexus, technically distinct from a slave. In practice, he could remove you to his estate, feed you the minimum quantity allowed, work you through planting season and harvest season and the season after that, while your land sat unworked, while your family managed without you, while the debt continued to accrue. There was a formal exit. Rome called it redemption. A third party, a family member, a patron, a stranger, could pay the full debt on your behalf and you would be released. But here is what history does not say plainly. The creditor was not required to accept the payment. He could refuse an offer of redemption. He could dispute the calculation. He could extend the accounting period. The exit existed on paper. The exit was controlled entirely by the man who profited from keeping you inside. And this is where it gets worse. The man holding your contract was, in many cases, the same man who would sit in judgment if you ever formally disputed it. The same bench. The same face. You wake before first light on his land. Your body knows the hour without being told. The stone floor holds no warmth. The other workers around you are already moving. Nobody speaks at this hour. There is nothing to say. You are fed. Barely. Enough to work. Not enough to think clearly about anything beyond the next furrow, the next task, the edge of the next season. Some mornings, the overseer comes to the row where you are working. He reads aloud from a wax tablet. He tells you how much you still owe. He says it the way someone announces the weather. Flat. Without cruelty. Without interest. The number is always larger than you carried in your head. There are small things they leave you with. The memory of what your own field looked like at the beginning of spring. The knowledge that your wife is still in your house, for now. A belief, faint but persistent, that this harvest might be the one that changes the calculation. You hold that belief the way you hold water in your cupped hands, already knowing it is going. One afternoon, the creditor walks the edge of the field. He does not look at you, not with contempt, not with anything. You are an entry in a ledger. You are a number that is working correctly. You could see the exit. But the exit was part of the trap. There is a man on this estate who has been here for 11 years. You have watched him. He does not talk about his land anymore. He does not mention his children. When someone new arrives and asks him questions about his family, he looks at a point past their shoulder and says nothing useful. You notice this. You put it somewhere you do not examine directly. The false hope arrives on a schedule. Every harvest, the overseer announces the debt has moved, sometimes a small amount down, often sideways, occasionally up. You have no counter ledger. You have no witness who will stand beside yours. You have no legal standing to challenge a patrician's accounting in a patrician's court. Roman law does protect you from certain things. The creditor cannot kill you without cause recognized by law. He cannot sell your person outside Roman territory without formal process. These are the edges of the permitted. Everything inside those edges is allowed. The exhaustion that settles into the bones by the second year. The separation from your family that becomes harder to measure as seasons blur. The small ceremonies of control, the morning count, the public debt announcement, the assignment of the worst labor to the men who have been here longest. You begin to understand something that no one says directly. The debt was never designed to be repaid. Repayment would end the arrangement. The arrangement produces more value than the original loan. Your labor over years is worth more than the grain you borrowed. Nobody inside the system knew this part. Or rather, the people who needed not to know it did not know it. And the people who knew it had no reason to explain it. Here is what history does not put in one place. The men who wrote Roman debt law were patricians. The men who held the grain reserves were patricians. The men who assessed the interest rates were patricians. The men who sat as magistrates in debt dispute cases were patricians. This was not coincidence. It was architecture. Rome's early republic operated on a formal class division. Patricians held the Senate. Patricians held the courts. Patricians held land rights, military command, priestly office, and grain distribution. Plebeians, the farmers, the craftsmen, the soldiers, held votes. But the votes came after the debts. The Nexum system accomplished something that direct slavery could not. It converted a free citizen's economic vulnerability into permanent labor extraction without ever appearing on the slave census. The slave was a slave. Every Roman understood that category. The nexus debtor was a free citizen in temporary difficulty. That framing was not accidental. That framing was load-bearing. It made the mechanism legible as law rather than capture. It preserved the appearance of the republic functioning fairly. And here is the design that history almost never names in a single sentence. The interest rate was calibrated high enough that most debtors could not repay. The accounting was controlled entirely by the creditor. The courts were staffed by members of the creditor class. The formal exit, third-party redemption, was subject to creditor veto. Every single mechanism that could have permitted escape was owned by the man who profited from preventing it. This was not a flaw in Roman law. This was the point of Roman law. And here is where it gets worse. It did not trap individuals. It trapped bloodlines. Debt transferred at death. 1 drought. 3 generations. History calls this Roman law. But that's not what this was. The same men who wrote the debt laws were the men who lent the money. The same men who lent the money were the men who judged the cases. The same men who judged the cases were the men who controlled the accounting. The same men who controlled the accounting were the men who could veto your redemption. History calls this Roman law. But that's not what this was. This was a system, a closed loop, engineered so that a free Roman citizen, a man who had fought Rome's wars, paid Rome's taxes, voted in Rome's assemblies, could be converted, legally, formally, with 5 witnesses and a bronze scale, into permanent labor for the men who ran the Republic. It was not brutal because Rome was primitive. It was precise because Rome was sophisticated. The ceremony, the witnesses, the weights, those were not tradition. They were legitimacy. They made the trap feel like a contract. They made the capture feel like consent. And it was designed specifically for people like you, not for criminals, not for enemies. For the soldier who came home from the legions to find his harvest gone. For the farmer who had one bad season he did not cause. For the man who believed that Roman law existed to protect him. The design was deliberate. The patrician class needed a permanent labor reserve that did not appear as property on the census. Nexum gave them that. It gave them workers who still believed in the possibility of freedom. That belief, the faint possibility of repayment, was not a flaw in the mechanism. It was the mechanism. It kept you working. It kept you from burning anything down. You mapped the exits. Every man inside the system eventually did this. Exit 1. Repay the full debt. The interest compounded. The accounting was the creditors alone. You had no legal instrument to dispute his figures in a court he staffed. The mathematics made full repayment structurally improbable for most debtors. This was not fate. This was calibration. Exit 2. Third-party redemption. A family member, patron, or stranger pays the debt and you are released. Your family had nothing. Your neighbors were managing their own obligations. A patron might intervene, but patrons invested in people who could return value. A nexus debtor on another man's land returned nothing to a patron, and even if someone came with the coin, the creditor could refuse. He often did. Exit 3. Legal appeal. To whom? The magistrates were patricians. The Senate was patricians. The entire formal apparatus that might, in theory, hear a complaint about Nexum abuse was staffed by the class that required Nexum to exist. Exit 4. Flee. Rome maintained a citizen census. A runaway nexus debtor was a fugitive. The debt did not dissolve. It transferred to whoever could be held liable, usually your family. Exit 5. Wait for political reform. The plebeians did organize. The conflict of the orders lasted 2 centuries. The Lex Poetelia Papiria abolished Nexum in 326 BC, but if you signed your contract in 400 BC, reform was 74 years away. Every exit led back to the same trap. Not because escape was cosmically impossible. Because the men who built the system had spent considerable effort ensuring that every door they left open led to a room they also controlled. History called it fate. It wasn't. Nexum was abolished in 326 BC. The pattern was not. The structure appears in every era under a different name. The specific mechanism changes. The architecture holds. An interest rate set at a level that makes full repayment statistically unlikely for someone in your income bracket. An accounting system controlled entirely by the lender. A legal challenge process expensive enough that disputing the numbers costs more than absorbing them. A legislative class that writes lending law while holding lending interests. The ceremony looks different now. There is no bronze scale, no formal Latin spoken aloud. There is a document stack, a signature line at the bottom. The weight of something that feels official, that feels fair, that feels like an agreement between equals. History calls this the financial system. Rome needed a labor supply that believed in the possibility of exit. Nexum provided that. Every system since has found its own version of the same mechanism. The details change. The architecture holds. And the most important component, in Rome and in every version that followed, was never the debt itself. It was the belief that the exit was real, that if you worked hard enough, paid carefully enough, stayed compliant enough, you would eventually get out. That belief is not a comfort. That belief is the system working exactly as designed. History called it Nexum, a debt contract, a legal instrument, a Roman institution eventually corrected by an enlightened republic. But now you know what it actually was. And the system has been waiting 2,350 years for someone to call it by its real name. One question remains open. The Lex Poetelia Papiria abolished Nexum in 326 BC. The men who wrote that reform law, who sat in the new courts it created, were the same class of men who built the system in the first place. Next, there is a position inside one of history's most powerful courts that history barely recorded. The person who held it stood closer to power than almost anyone, and was never permitted to speak, not because they had nothing to say, because the system required their silence. If you want to be there when that system gets named, subscribe to ZAM History. We are here every Sunday. And if this video changed how you see something, leave that in the comments. The algorithm buries channels like this one. Your comment is how it survives.